Good afternoon. My name is Matt Merritt. I'm with North Carolina Rural Water. I'm here to show you how we test backflows here in North Carolina. The RP procedures come out of the 9th edition, and they have been approved by the Water Board of Examiners of North Carolina. So first one I'm going to do is the Watts 009 M3 QT, which means it's a quarter-turn ball valve. Backflow preventer. You want to write all your information down, the serial number and all that, to make sure it matches with the homeowner or the customer's address to where you tested it. And also, rule of thumb, you want to notify the customer, check your area, check your test kit, then we're going to flush our test cots. We're using the 5-valve test kits, 845. This is a low bleed, high bleed, low control, high control bypass valve. This here is for your line pressure. This is the gauge that you'll read to get the differential pressure between the checks, your first check, second check, and the relief valve. So I notified the customer, so I'm going to go ahead and shut off the number 2 shutoff valve. The RP has got a certain order that we have to flush the test cots. The reason being, you don't want to open up number 1 or 2 or 3 first, because you may cause the relief valve to spit or dump. So you don't want to prematurely make the relief valve dump because of the pressure fluctuations. So we open up number 4. I'm going to open up real slow. Let it run. Go 3, 2, then 1, then off with 1, off with 2, off with 3, off with 4. All right. Some of the Midwest test kits, the hoses may be, and you'll always have red for the high pressure. This blue is for low, or it may be green if you have an older kit, and then the yellow is the bypass hose, or it could be black with the other hoses. So we're going to hook up the high hose to test cot 2. Come on, go on there. Low to 3. And we always want to open up test cot 3 first. Make sure the valves are closed, because it should be stored left open. So we open up our test cot 3, open up the low bleed, let it run, then open up test cot 2, then open up the high bleed, close the high bleed, and close the low bleed. When I teach classes, I always tell the students the high bleed valve you will only use twice during the whole 8-step procedures for the RP. So the first thing I'm going to do, I've already shut off the number 2 shutoff valve since I notified the customer. 2 things I want to get. First is my line pressure, which is about 60 psi. Then we're going to look at the gauge to observe the reading for check valve number 1. Because manufacturer specification says it has to be 5 or greater. So we're at 9, so we're good to go. So first thing I'm going to do is record my line pressure. I'll record that in for 60. Then at the top of the paper, I'll put observe that the number 1 check was at 9. All right. So the first operational test we're going to do is the relief valve. So these down here are like control valves. This works like a little manifold. So open up my high control valve, 2 full turns. So what I'm doing is I'm going to transfer water to my low side, to my relief valve dumps. I put it my hand here, and it dumped at 2.9. So I close off my low control valve. And I record that for step number 2 is 2.9. Now what we've done, I bypassed the first and second check, and I took water, come through my low side and gone through the low side, and I'm increasing pressure to assist the relief valve opening. So now I'm going to do a wet connection and hook the test cot 4, because the next test we're going to do is a back pressure test on number 2 check. So I kind of crack this a little bit, get a little water coming out so I can get all the air out. And I'm going to tighten it up on test cot 4. Close my bypass, open 4. Reset the gauge. Always when we say reset the gauge, you open the low bleed valve, close it. What I've done, I'm taking water through my test kit, coming through here, because I let this open. High pressure water's coming through here, going through my bypass hose, and I'm putting back pressure on my number 2 check. This is your first line of defense from the building that the backflow preventer goes to. So if it's not dripping, my gauge holds steady, that tells me my the number 2 check is holding against back pressure. So I come here, mark my box here, number 2 check is holding for back pressure. So we always want to make sure that our shutoff valve is holding. So what we do is come in, close off number 2 test cock. Because if the number 2 shutoff valve is not holding, all the tests that you've done are invalid. So as soon as I close test cock 2, my gauge holds steady, that tells me shutoff valve number 2 is holding tight. Now, if I was to close the number 2 test cock and my needle was to fall, then that tells me water's going to the customer that the shutoff valve is leaking. Or if I close the number 2 test cock and the needle rises, that tells me I got back pressure. But in this situation, the number 2 shutoff valve is holding tight. So I'll check the box down here that is closed tight. So now I close my bypass valve, open up the number 2 test cock, reset the gauge. We're going to check the number 1 check. Remember, it has to be 5 or greater, but in North Carolina, we do this thing we call the buffer. We want the number 1 check to be at least 3 psi greater than the relief valve opening. And that relief valve opening at 2.9. So my number 1 check is holding tight, and it's reading right at 9 now. So I subtract my relief valve opening 2.9 from 9, and that's going to give me a, let's see here, do my math, 6.1 is my buffer. So I'm above 3, so I am good to go. So now I come here, close off test cocks 3 and 4. Always bleed the water out. And close off test cock 4. Throw your yellow hose, you won't need it anymore. Close it. Open this up. And we're going to put this on test cock 4. And put this on test cock 3. Close these back off. Open up test cock 4. Do this. Let it bleed, my low bleed. Open up test cock 3. High bleed. Close my high bleed. Close my low bleed because the number 2 check has to hold greater than 1 psi greater. And we are holding at 1.9. So check valve number 2 is holding. So this backflow preventer has passed its test. So I close test cocks 3, 4, bleed the water out, take these hoses loose. And restore water to my customer and turn my paperwork into the municipality.